I never wanted to go on that fishing trip. If you'd asked me a week earlier how I planned to spend the first weekend of summer, I would have said anything except sitting in the middle of a lake with a fishing rod in my hands. I'd rather sleep until noon, waste an entire day playing video games, or drive to the coast with friends. Fishing had always seemed like one of those hobbies people inherited from older generations, something you tolerated because your dad liked it. Unfortunately, this trip wasn't even with my dad. It was with his best friend, Dennis. My father had known Dennis since they were kids. They'd grown up on the same street, gone to the same schools, started their first jobs together, and somehow stayed close through everything life threw at them. Even after Dad got married and Dennis never did, they still met almost every weekend. Barbecues, football games, fishing trips, it had always been their thing. I'd known Dennis my whole life. He'd been around at birthdays, family dinners, Christmas mornings, and every graduation party I could remember. He was one of those adults who somehow never talked down to kids. When I was 10, he'd let me help him fix an old motorcycle in his garage. At 14, he taught me how to change a tire after I got stranded with a flat bicycle halfway across town. By 18, we mostly joked with each other like equals. Now I was 23. He was 42. And somehow Dad had decided the two of us should spend an entire weekend together. "You'll have fun," Dad said while loading groceries into the kitchen. "I seriously doubt that. Dennis asked if you'd come." I frowned. "He did?" Dad nodded. "His usual fishing buddy backed out. I've got to stay because of work. He figured you might enjoy getting away for a couple of days." I wasn't convinced. "I don't even know how to fish." "You don't have to. Then what's the point?" Dad laughed. "The point is getting away from your phone for 48 hours. I rolled my eyes. "You sound ancient." "So does Dennis." That made me smile despite myself. Dennis had this habit of acting older than he actually was. He complained about modern music while secretly listening to it. He insisted handwritten notes were better than texting, yet somehow replied to messages within 30 seconds every time. He wasn't old. He just liked pretending he was. "You'll survive," Dad said. "I'll probably die of boredom." "You won't." He looked at me for a second before adding quietly, "And Dennis has had a rough couple of months." That caught my attention. "What happened?" Dad hesitated. "You know his mom passed away." I nodded. It had happened 3 months earlier. I'd gone to the funeral with my parents. Dennis had stood beside the casket greeting people for hours, thanking everyone for coming with that same calm voice he always used. At the time I thought he was handling it surprisingly well. Maybe he wasn't. "He doesn't really say much," Dad continued, "but I think being alone in that house has been harder than he expected." I looked down at the countertop. "I didn't realize." "He won't tell you that either." Dad picked up another grocery bag. "But sometimes people just need company." I didn't answer immediately. The fishing trip suddenly felt less like an inconvenience. "Fine," I sighed. "I'll go." Dad smiled. "I knew you would. I didn't say I'd enjoy it." "You don't have to." He grinned. "But I think you might." I left early Saturday morning before sunrise. Dennis was already waiting outside his pickup truck when I pulled into his driveway. He looked exactly like he always did. Dark jeans, flannel shirt, coffee mug in one hand, baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. The only difference was that he'd grown a short beard since I'd last seen him. It made him look more tired somehow. He smiled when he spotted me. "Morning, Philip." "Barely." He laughed. "I'll take that as enthusiasm." "You'd be wrong." He grabbed my duffel bag before I could stop him. "I can carry it." "I know. So why are you?" "Because I'm older." "That's not how age works." "It does when I say it does." I shook my head. "I forgot how stubborn you are. I learned from your father." "That's terrifying." He tossed my bag into the truck bed. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." The drive took almost 3 hours. For the first 40 minutes we barely spoke. The road stretched through endless forests, while classic rock played quietly through the speakers. Normally, silence with someone older would have felt awkward. With Dennis, it somehow didn't. "You still working at the design firm?" he asked eventually. "Yeah. Like it?" "Most days." "And the other days?" "I pretend I like it." He chuckled. "That's called adulthood. I was afraid you'd say that." He glanced over briefly. "You'll figure it out." "I hope so." "You've got time." That answer surprised me. Most older adults loved telling people my age that we were wasting time. Dennis never did. He always sounded like there was enough of it. After another hour, he pulled into a tiny roadside diner. "Breakfast? I thought we were in a hurry." "We're not. You've got fish waiting. They'll survive another 30 minutes. Inside, the place smelled like coffee and pancakes. There were maybe 6 customers scattered around the room. Everyone seemed to know Dennis. A waitress smiled the second we walked in. "Morning, stranger." "Morning, Linda. Haven't seen you in weeks." "Life got busy." She glanced toward me with a curious smile. "This your son?" Dennis laughed. "No. This is Philip. My best friend's kid." I smiled politely. She nodded. "I remember you now. You were this tall the last time I saw you." She held her hand somewhere around chest height. "I hope I've improved since then." "You definitely eat more." Dennis laughed harder than the joke deserved. We ordered breakfast. The conversation drifted between work, sports, and stories about people I'd never met. At one point, Linda brought over fresh coffee without Dennis asking. "The usual? You know me too well. I've known you 20 years. She smiled before walking away. I watched him stir cream into his mug. "You come here a lot?" "Used to." "Not anymore?" He shrugged. "Not as much." There was something different about his voice. Not sad. Just quieter. I remembered what Dad had said. Being alone. Losing his mom. Maybe this place carried too many memories now. I didn't ask. Instead, I changed the subject. "So, you planning to teach me how not to embarrass myself today?" Dennis smiled. "I wasn't planning on teaching." "No? I figured I'd let you embarrass yourself naturally." I laughed. "That's cruel." "It's educational." For the first time that morning, the trip actually started feeling easy. Like maybe spending 2 days together wouldn't be nearly as difficult as I'd imagined. I had no idea that the weekend would end up changing far more than either of us expected. The cabin sat at the edge of a quiet lake that looked almost unreal in the morning light. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding pine trees so clearly it was hard to tell where the shoreline ended and the sky began. There wasn't another cabin in sight, just miles of forest stretching in every direction. Dennis parked the truck beside a weathered wooden dock and climbed out. "Welcome to civilization," he said. I looked around. "I think civilization got lost." "Exactly." He inhaled deeply before smiling to himself. "I miss this place." There was something different about him the moment we arrived. The tiredness I'd noticed during the drive seemed lighter somehow. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time all morning, he looked completely at ease. "You own this cabin?" I asked. He nodded. "My grandfather built it." "When?" 1968. "No way." He smiled. "My dad helped him. Then I helped my dad fix it every summer after that." I ran my hand across the wooden railing. Everything looked old but carefully maintained. Not luxurious. Just loved. "I've been coming here since I was younger than you." "That's actually pretty cool." "I think so too." He unlocked the front door. Inside, the cabin was simple. 2 bedrooms. A small kitchen. A fireplace. A worn leather couch facing enormous windows overlooking the lake. Fishing rods rested neatly against one wall. Shelves were filled with books that looked decades old. There wasn't a television. "There really isn't any Wi-Fi, is there?" Dennis grinned. "I warned you. This is barbaric." You'll survive. I might start talking to squirrels. They're good listeners. I laughed. You've definitely spent too much time here. He pointed toward the hallway. Your room's on the left. I dropped my bag inside before wandering back into the living room. Dennis was already unpacking food into the kitchen. You want help? You know how to make sandwiches? I graduated college. That wasn't my question. I can make sandwiches. Perfect. For the next 20 minutes we worked quietly beside each other. It felt strangely domestic. Comfortable. He handed me a loaf of bread. Turkey or ham? Turkey. Good answer. You judge sandwich choices? Absolutely. That's concerning. You'll learn. After lunch we carried supplies down to the dock. Dennis handed me a fishing rod. This one's yours. I stared at it. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I know. So why are you trusting me with expensive equipment? Because if you break it, your father will pay for it. I looked at him. You planned this. Years ago. The boat was small enough for just the two of us. Once we drifted away from shore, the silence settled around us again. Not empty. Peaceful. Dennis showed me how to cast a line. My first attempt sent the lure directly into a nearby bush. He watched it disappear into the branches. What? I've seen worse. You have not. I absolutely have. You don't have to lie. I'm not. He stood up carefully, untangled the line without saying a word, and handed the rod back. Try again. The second attempt landed in the water. Barely. But it counted. There you go. I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. Mostly wait. That's the whole hobby? Pretty much. People actually enjoy this? Dennis smiled. The fishing isn't really the point. Then what's the point? He looked across the lake before answering. You stop hearing all the noise. I frowned. What noise? He tapped 2 fingers lightly against the side of his head. This kind. I didn't respond immediately. The lake was completely silent except for birds somewhere in the trees. No traffic. No phones. No conversations. Just water gently rocking the boat. After a while, I realized I hadn't thought about work once since we'd arrived. Maybe he had a point. So, I said eventually, you've really been coming here your whole life? Almost. What about your family? My parents loved it. His smile softened. My mom hated catching fish. But she came anyway. Every year. He chuckled quietly. She'd read books on the dock while Dad and I stayed out here. I listened without interrupting. She always packed way too much food. That's what moms do. Yeah. He stared across the water. I still keep finding recipes she wrote. There it was again. That quiet sadness. Not overwhelming. Just present. I miss her. The words came out so simply that they caught me off guard. No dramatic pause. No attempt to hide it. Just honesty. I'm sorry. He nodded. I know. I keep thinking I'll call her. He looked down at his fishing line. Then I remember. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally I said, my dad misses her too. Dennis smiled faintly. They talked every Sunday. I remember. She used to ask about you. Really? Every week. What did she ask? If you were eating enough. I laughed. Seriously? She never believed young men knew how to feed themselves. She wasn't entirely wrong. He smiled a little wider. I told her you'd survive. Thanks for the vote of confidence. The conversation drifted naturally after that. He told stories about growing up with my father. Apparently Dad had once tried building a treehouse that collapsed before they even climbed into it. He blamed the nails. What actually happened? He forgot half the boards. I laughed so hard the boat rocked. I'm absolutely telling him you said that. You should. I might even exaggerate. He'll deserve it. Hours passed without either of us noticing. We caught exactly 3 fish. Dennis released all of them. You don't even keep them? No. So we've basically been politely bothering fish all afternoon. Pretty much. This hobby gets stranger every hour. As the sun began dropping toward the trees, the entire lake turned gold. Dennis rested his fishing rod across his knees. Beautiful, isn't it? I looked around. It really was. I get it now. What? Why you keep coming back? He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said quietly, some places remember people for you. I turned toward him. What do you mean? My parents are everywhere here. He looked toward the old cabin. I hear my dad complaining about loose boards. He smiled faintly. I hear my mom yelling that dinner's ready. The smile faded. When I stay home. He stopped. What? The house is just quiet. I understood. Or at least I thought I did. Maybe the cabin wasn't where he escaped. Maybe it was the last place where he still felt surrounded by people he'd loved. That thought stayed with me all the way back to shore. That evening we cooked dinner together in the tiny kitchen. Well, Dennis cooked. I mostly handed him ingredients while pretending to be useful. You've seriously never learned to cook? I know enough. No. You know enough not to starve. I feel attacked. You should. After dinner we carried our coffee onto the porch. The lake reflected thousands of stars. I'd never seen the sky look like that before. No city lights. No traffic. Just darkness and constellations. Dennis leaned back in the old wooden chair. I used to sit out here with your dad until 2 in the morning. What did you talk about? Everything. And now? He smiled. Now he falls asleep by 10. Age. Exactly. I laughed. A cool breeze drifted across the lake. Neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually Dennis looked over at me. You know. I'm glad you came. I smiled. I'm glad I did too. And for the first time all weekend, I realized I meant it completely. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For a few seconds, I had no idea where I was. The room smelled faintly of pine and old wood, and soft sunlight filtered through the curtains. Somewhere outside, birds were making enough noise to convince the entire forest that dawn had officially arrived. Then I remembered. The cabin. The lake. Dennis. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal. I laughed quietly to myself. Maybe that was becoming less painful than I'd expected. When I walked into the kitchen, Dennis was already making coffee. You're up early. I looked at the clock. It's almost 7. For you, that's early. I hate that you're right. He handed me a mug. Sleep okay? Better than I have in weeks. The silence helps. It really does. He nodded toward the window. Come outside. The lake looked completely different from the evening before. A thin layer of mist floated above the water, making everything seem almost unreal. We stood on the porch without speaking. Finally, I broke the silence. Do you ever get lonely out here? Dennis thought about it. Out here? He shook his head. No. Never? No. He took another sip of coffee. I get lonely in town. That answer surprised me. I would have guessed the opposite. Most people do. He leaned against the railing. When I'm here, I know why I'm alone. I frowned. What does that mean? I chose to come. He looked across the lake. Back home. His voice grew quieter. The house chooses for me. I understood immediately. The silence at the cabin felt peaceful. The silence in an empty home felt different. It reminded you who wasn't there. We spent the morning repairing part of the dock. Well, Dennis repaired it. I mostly held boards in place while trying not to hit my own fingers with a hammer. You've definitely never built anything. I build presentations. Those don't count. They pay my rent. Fair point. A loose plank slipped from my hands and splashed into the water. Dennis looked at me. I was testing gravity. It still works. Excellent. He laughed. You know. What? You're a lot funnier than your father. I'll never tell him you said that. Good. I'll use it against him forever. Around noon we finished. Dennis stepped back to inspect our work. Looks decent. You mean your work looks decent? Our work. I handed you nails. You handed them very professionally. I rolled my eyes. You've gotten softer with age. I have. No shame in admitting it. I'll deny everything. We decided to hike after lunch. A narrow trail wound through the forest behind the cabin, climbing gradually toward a rocky overlook. Dennis walked ahead, pointing out different trees and plants like he'd memorized every inch of the place. You actually know all these? I've been walking this trail for 30 years. Still, I get bored easily. I don't believe that. He smiled. No? No one who enjoys fishing gets bored. I knew that joke was coming. About halfway up the trail, we reached a fallen log overlooking a small stream. Dennis sat down. I joined him. The water rushed over smooth rocks below us. You ever think about moving? I asked. From town? Yeah. He shrugged. Sometimes. So why don't you? My life's there. Is it? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Dennis looked at me. What makes you ask? I hesitated. You always sound happier here. He smiled faintly. I am. So why stay? He watched the water for a long moment. Because memories aren't enough to build a life. That sentence stayed with me. I think. He paused. I got very good at living the same year over and over. I frowned. What do you mean? My routine never changes. He counted on his fingers. Work. Home. Help your dad with something. Repeat. It feels safe. But safe and happy aren't always the same thing. That didn't sound like the Dennis I'd always known. He'd always seemed content. Steady. Reliable. Maybe I'd confused routine with happiness. I don't think I've ever heard you talk like this. He smiled. My mother used to tell me I spent too much time taking care of everyone else. You do. He looked surprised. You noticed? I think everyone notices. He laughed quietly. I guess I do. You helped Dad rebuild our garage. You drove 3 hours to help me move apartments. You fixed my car last winter. You brought food over when Mom had the flu. He rubbed the back of his neck. That's just... Dennis. You never ask anyone for anything. He looked down at the stream. I've never been very good at it. Why? He thought for a long time. My dad believed you solved your own problems. Did he? He meant well. Dennis smiled sadly. He just wasn't very good at needing people. Something about the way he said it made me wonder if he wasn't talking about his father anymore. When your mom got sick, I began carefully. Were you alone? He didn't answer immediately. Mostly. What about friends? They checked in. My dad? He was there. But he has his own family. Dennis looked at the water again. I didn't want to become someone everyone worried about. You wouldn't have. I know. But grief makes you think strange things. Neither of us spoke after that. We simply listened to the stream. Eventually Dennis stood. We should keep going. The overlook sat at the highest point of the trail. From there, we could see the entire lake below us. The cabin looked tiny. The boat was barely visible against the dock. I whistled softly. This is incredible. Dennis smiled. My grandfather used to bring me here. When you were little? Every trip. What did he tell you? He'd point at the lake and say. Dennis chuckled. Life always looks simpler from far away. Did you believe him? I do now. We stayed there for almost an hour, talking about everything except fishing. Books. Movies. Travel. Work. Dreams we'd never told many people about. I realized something strange. For someone I'd known my entire life, I barely knew Dennis at all. I'd known him as my father's best friend. The dependable guy who always showed up. The man who fixed things without being asked. But sitting beside him on that overlook, listening to him laugh about mistakes he'd made in his 20s, hearing him admit regrets he'd never shared before, he suddenly felt like a complete person instead of simply an adult I'd grown up around. And somehow, that realization made it impossible to see him exactly the same way again. We made it back to the cabin just before sunset. Neither of us was in much of a hurry. The hike had left us pleasantly tired, and instead of talking constantly like we had earlier, we walked side by side in comfortable silence. It struck me how unusual that felt. Most silences demanded to be filled. This one didn't. Dennis unlocked the cabin and tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter. Pizza? I blinked. I thought we were miles away from civilization. We are. So. He opened the freezer. I came prepared. I laughed. You've been hiding frozen pizza from me? I didn't want to ruin the rustic experience. Very considerate. 20 minutes later we were eating on the porch again, paper plates balanced on our knees. The sky glowed orange above the trees. I looked over at Dennis. Can I ask you something? You just did. You know what I mean. He smiled. Go ahead. Why didn't you ever get married? The question came out more directly than I'd intended. For a second, I wondered if I'd crossed the line. Dennis didn't seem offended. He just looked out toward the lake. I've been asked that a lot. And? I usually make a joke. I'm asking for the real answer. He stayed quiet long enough that I thought he might refuse. Instead, he said softly, I kept waiting. For who? The right person. I nodded. Did you ever meet them? A faint smile appeared. I thought I did. What happened? It didn't work. Long time ago? Almost 15 years. I didn't push. He volunteered the rest on his own. We wanted different lives. I'm sorry. He shrugged gently. So was I. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only acceptance. You never dated again? A little. But nothing serious. Why? He smiled to himself. I suppose I became comfortable alone. I wasn't convinced. Or maybe. He corrected himself. I became used to it. There was a difference. A big one. Comfort and habit weren't the same thing. You deserve better than just getting used to things. The words escaped before I could think. Dennis looked at me for a moment. That's a nice thing to say. I mean it. He smiled. I know. The conversation drifted somewhere lighter after that. We argued about whether old movies were actually better than new ones. Dennis insisted they were. I accused him of nostalgia. He claimed modern films relied too much on explosions. I claimed his favorites were all 3 hours long. He admitted that was fair. Eventually darkness settled over the lake. Dennis stood. Come on. Where? You'll see. He grabbed 2 flashlights from inside the cabin. We followed a narrow path away from the shoreline until the trees opened into a small grassy clearing. The stars were unbelievable. I'd never seen so many. Wow. Dennis switched off his flashlight. No city lights. No distractions. He lay back in the grass. I hesitated before doing the same. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now. More thoughtful. You know what my mom used to do? Dennis asked. What? She'd make up stories about the constellations. I thought they already had stories. They do. She ignored those. I smiled. What kind of stories? He pointed upward. See those 3 bright stars? I think so. She said they were 3 brothers who kept getting lost because none of them would admit they needed directions. I laughed. That's ridiculous. I know. But she'd tell them so seriously. He smiled at the memory. When I was 6, I believed every word. What made you stop believing? I got older. You don't sound happy about that. I'm not. I turned my head toward him. You miss being a kid? No. He looked up at the sky. I miss believing people stayed forever. The sentence hung in the cool night air. I knew he wasn't only talking about childhood. My grandfather died first. He spoke quietly. Then Dad. Now Mom. He swallowed. The older you get. He paused. The smaller your world becomes. I didn't know what to say. So I simply listened. I keep looking around. He gave a quiet laugh without humor. And realizing I'm becoming the oldest person in the room. I stared at the stars. I'd never thought about life that way. At 23, everyone around me still seemed permanent. Parents, uncles, neighbors, friends. The future always felt full. Dennis had already lived through enough to know otherwise. My dad would hate hearing you talk like that. Dennis smiled. I know. He'd tell me to stop being dramatic. He probably would. And then he'd invite me over for barbecue. I laughed. Definitely. Dennis was quiet again. Your father has been my best friend for almost 35 years. That's incredible. It is. He smiled softly. I've watched you grow up. I know. I still remember teaching you how to ride a bike. You also let me crash into your mailbox. You insisted you didn't need help. I was 8. You were stubborn. I still am. You definitely are. We both laughed. Then he looked at me with a thoughtful expression. You've changed a lot. Hopefully for the better. You've become calmer. I don't feel calmer. No? I shook my head. I spend half my life worrying that everyone else knows what they're doing. Dennis laughed. Trust me. They don't? Not even adults? Especially adults. You've always seemed like you have everything figured out. His smile faded slightly. I've gotten good at looking like I do. That surprised me. You. Everyone's carrying something. He looked back toward the stars. They just don't always show it. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly wanted him to know something. When I was a kid, I began. I always thought you were the person who could fix anything. Dennis chuckled. I remember. You fixed bikes. You fixed cars. You fixed half the neighborhood. I tried. But mostly. I smiled. You made people feel like everything would be okay. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. I don't know if anyone's ever told me that. They should have. He turned toward me. For a long second, neither of us looked away. There was nothing uncomfortable about it. Just something I couldn't quite name. Then Dennis smiled. Thank you, Philip. The moment passed naturally. We lay back again, watching the stars in silence. But something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough for me to realize that this weekend had quietly become about far more than fishing. And somewhere deep inside me, a question had begun to form. One I wasn't ready to ask. Not even myself. The last morning arrived much faster than either of us expected. I woke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the roof. Not a storm. Just a steady summer rain that wrapped the cabin in a kind of quiet I'd never experienced before. When I walked into the kitchen, Dennis was standing by the window with a mug of coffee, watching the lake disappear behind a curtain of mist. Looks like nature made today's plans for us, I said. He smiled without looking away. I don't mind. You. I've always liked rainy mornings. Why? They make people slow down. I poured myself coffee and stood beside him. The dock was almost invisible. The trees on the opposite shore faded into pale gray. Everything felt smaller. Closer. It almost doesn't look real, I said. No. It doesn't. We stayed there for several minutes without speaking. Eventually Dennis sighed. I never used to notice mornings. What changed? He smiled faintly. My mother. I looked over. She'd wake up before everyone else. Coffee? And a book. He nodded toward the window. I'd come out here half asleep and she'd already be sitting on the porch. He laughed quietly. She always said the world belonged to people who woke up early. You believe that now? I think she just liked having an hour to herself. We carried our mugs onto the covered porch. The rain drummed softly on the roof above us. For the first time all weekend, neither of us felt any need to fill the silence. I realized I had become comfortable with it. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I didn't feel pressured to say everything. Dennis finally broke the quiet. You know, I wasn't sure this trip was a good idea. I looked at him. Really? You've got your own life. Friends. Work. I figured you'd spend the whole weekend wishing you were somewhere else. I smiled. I did. He raised an eyebrow. For about the first 30 minutes. He laughed. That's fair. I honestly thought I'd be bored. And? I don't think I've checked my phone in almost 2 days. You couldn't. I know. But eventually I stopped wanting to. He nodded slowly. That's usually when this place starts working. I looked around the porch. How many people have been here? What do you mean? Over the years. He thought for a moment. My grandparents. My parents. Your dad. A few friends. He smiled. And now you. You make it sound like joining a very exclusive club. It kind of is. The rain began falling harder. A breeze pushed cool air across the porch. Dennis leaned back in his chair. Can I ask you something? Of course. What scares you most right now? The question caught me completely off guard. I laughed awkwardly. That's not exactly small talk. I know. I looked out at the rain. I guess. I searched for an honest answer. I'm scared I'll wake up one day and realize I built a life I never actually wanted. Dennis didn't interrupt. I like my job. I think. But I don't know if I chose it because I wanted it. Or because it seemed like the obvious next step. I rubbed my hands together. Everyone keeps asking where I see myself in 10 years. I honestly don't know where I see myself next year. Dennis nodded thoughtfully. I remember feeling exactly like that. You do? Oh, absolutely. You always seemed so certain. He laughed. I changed careers twice before I was 30. What? You didn't know that? No. I thought you'd always been an engineer. I worked in sales first. I stared at him. Seriously? Worst 2 years of my life. I can't even picture that. Neither can I. He grinned. I was terrible. That made me laugh. So what changed? I finally admitted I was living someone else's idea of success. The sentence landed harder than I expected. I wish people talked about that more. They usually don't. Why? Because it sounds like failure. He shook his head. But changing your mind isn't failure. It's growth. I looked at him. When did you become so wise? I got old. There it is. I was waiting for the age joke. You practically handed it to me. He smiled. I suppose I did. The rain eased a little. Dennis stood and walked toward one of the bookshelves inside. After a minute he returned carrying an old leather notebook. The edges were worn smooth. This belonged to my grandfather. He handed it to me. Inside were handwritten notes. Fishing dates. Weather reports. Little observations about the lake. Some entries were only one sentence long. June 14th. Saw 2 deer by the Eastern Trail. August 2nd. Best sunrise in years. September 11th. Philip's father finally caught a fish bigger than mine. He'll never let me forget it. I laughed. He actually wrote that? Dennis nodded. He documented everything. I turned another page. The handwriting changed near the end. It became shakier. Shorter. One entry caught my attention. Don't wait until life slows down. It never does. I read it twice. Dennis watched me quietly. He wrote that a year before he died. I closed the notebook carefully. I like him. You would have. He smiled. He had a habit of making people feel important. Something about that sentence made me look at Dennis. It wasn't just his grandfather. It was him too. He'd spent the entire weekend doing exactly that without ever drawing attention to himself. As if he noticed people in ways that made them feel seen. I wondered how many people had ever done the same for him. The thought stayed with me as we packed our bags later that morning. The cabin slowly returned to the way we'd found it. Beds made. Kitchen cleaned. Windows locked. Dennis took one last walk through each room before grabbing his keys. Ready? I looked around one final time. I think so. He nodded. Good. As we stepped outside, he paused on the porch. Every trip, he told me later, he did the same thing. He looked at the lake for exactly 30 seconds. Not because he believed it was lucky. Because he liked saying goodbye properly. I stood beside him without speaking. When the 30 seconds were over, he smiled. Let's head home. For reasons I couldn't explain, the word home sounded different than it had 2 days earlier. And as we climbed into the truck, I found myself wondering whether the most important part of the weekend wasn't the place we'd just left, but the conversation that still hadn't happened between us. The drive back felt different. Not awkward. Not quiet in the uncomfortable way. Just slower. The rain disappeared after about an hour, leaving the roads shining under the afternoon sun. Dennis kept one hand on the steering wheel, while classic rock played softly through the speakers again. Neither of us seemed eager to break whatever calm we'd brought back from the cabin. So, he finally said, you survived. I did. I'm impressed. I only complained, what? 20 times? Maximum 15. He smiled. I counted 23. I don't believe you. I rounded down. I laughed. You planned that joke. Most of them. I knew it. He glanced over with a grin. I had 2 days. About another hour later, we stopped at the same diner where we'd eaten breakfast on the way there. The waitress spotted Dennis immediately. Well? She smiled. You came back. Told you I would. Her eyes shifted toward me. So? She folded her arms dramatically. Did he convert you into one of those fishing people? I shook my head. Not even close. Dennis looked offended. I thought we made progress. We did. I still don't enjoy fishing. Linda laughed. So why are you smiling? I opened my mouth. Then realized I didn't actually know how to answer. Because it wasn't about fishing. Not even a little. Dennis rescued me. He likes the coffee. I do. See? He pointed at me. Small victories. While Linda walked away, I looked across the table. You know. What? I think your cabin tricks people. Oh? I've never talked that much with someone in 2 days. He leaned back thoughtfully. The cabin doesn't do anything. No? It just removes enough distractions that people finally hear themselves thinking. I wasn't sure whether he was right. But it certainly felt that way. When we reached town later that afternoon, reality returned almost immediately. Traffic. Phone notifications. Billboards. People rushing everywhere. My phone vibrated nonstop the second it found a signal. 32 messages. 8 emails. Several missed calls. I stared at the screen. Dennis noticed. Already feels louder, doesn't it? I locked the phone again. Yeah. It really does. He smiled knowingly. I always need a day to adjust. We pulled into my parents' driveway. Dad was already outside, pretending he hadn't been watching for us. There they are. He walked over before either of us got out. So? He looked at me. Did Dennis bore you to death? I almost survived. Dennis shook his head. He lies. I taught him everything he knows. Dad laughed. I find that hard to believe. The three of us unloaded the truck together. Mom came out a minute later and hugged me. You look rested. I actually am. She smiled. I was expecting complaints. I've retired. Dad looked suspicious. What happened out there? I answered honestly. We talked. He glanced toward Dennis. I told you. Dennis shrugged. I didn't do much. Dad laughed. That's usually when you do the most. For just a second, I noticed something pass between them. 35 years of friendship compressed into one quick smile. No explanation needed. No words. It made me wonder how many conversations they'd shared that looked exactly like this. Before Dennis left, Dad disappeared inside to grab something. That left the two of us standing beside his truck. Thanks, I said. For what? The weekend. He smiled. Thanks for coming. I'm glad you asked. So am I. There was a small pause. Then he reached into the truck and pulled out the old leather notebook. My grandfather's. I know. I want you to borrow it. I blinked. What? You liked it. I can't take that. You can. Dennis. It spent years teaching me things. He smiled gently. Maybe it'll teach you something too. I looked down at the notebook. I'll bring it back. No rush. Dad came back outside carrying a container wrapped in foil. Your mother insisted. Dennis laughed. I was wondering how long it'd take. Lasagna. Dad handed it over. She made too much. She always does. I know. They exchanged another smile. Dennis climbed into the truck. Before closing the door, he looked back at me. Philip. Yeah? Don't wait too long before taking another weekend off. I won't. I mean it. I know. Then he drove away. I watched until the truck disappeared around the corner. Well? Dad asked beside me. Well, what? What did you think? I looked down at the notebook still in my hands. I think. I searched for the right words. I've known Dennis my whole life. Dad nodded. But I don't think I actually knew him until this weekend. Dad smiled quietly. Most people don't. What do you mean? He doesn't volunteer much about himself. I noticed. But if you take the time to ask. Dad looked down the empty street where Dennis had disappeared. You find out there's a whole lot more there than people realize. That night I unpacked my bag slowly. Near the bottom was something I didn't remember packing. A folded piece of paper. I opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Dennis's. Philip. If you're reading this, it means you actually unpacked instead of leaving everything in your bag for a week. I'm proud of you. I laughed out loud. Thanks for making the trip easier than I expected. The cabin has a way of reminding people what matters. Don't let that feeling disappear just because you're back home. And one more thing. Your grandfather once told me that the people who change our lives rarely arrive as strangers. Usually they've been standing quietly in the background for years before we finally learn how to see them. I didn't understand what he meant when I was your age. Maybe one day you will. Dennis. I read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it back inside the notebook. I had the strange feeling that he hadn't written it only for this trip. It felt older. As though he'd been carrying those words around for a long time, waiting for the right moment to pass them on. I had no idea that, over the next few weeks, I would find myself thinking about Dennis far more often than I expected. And that every one of those thoughts would slowly begin to change something inside me that I hadn't even realized was changing. The first week after the trip disappeared beneath work. Emails. Deadlines. Meetings that should have been emails. By Wednesday afternoon, it already felt like the cabin belonged to someone else's life. Except it didn't. Little things kept bringing it back. I'd reach for my phone during lunch, then remember going 2 full days without checking it. I'd hear rain against my apartment window and think about sitting on that porch with Dennis, coffee warming my hands while the lake disappeared into the mist. One evening I caught myself looking through apartments online. Not because I wanted to move. Because I'd suddenly realized how little attention I'd paid to the place where I actually lived. It was strange. Nothing had happened on that trip. No huge revelation. No dramatic moment. Just conversations. Yet somehow I kept seeing ordinary life a little differently. Friday evening, Dad called. You busy tomorrow? Not really. Dennis is helping me replace the fence. I smiled. Of course he is. He said to tell you there's pizza involved. I laughed. That's bribery. It usually works. I'll be there. When I arrived Saturday morning, Dennis was already in the backyard measuring wooden posts. He looked up as I walked through the gate. Morning. You tricked me. I promised pizza. You used pizza to recruit free labor. He shrugged. It worked. Dad walked over carrying another stack of boards. I've been doing this for 30 years. He always uses food. Dennis looked offended. It's called leadership. It's called manipulation, Dad replied. Watching them together was entertaining. They argued constantly. Not angry arguments. Comfortable ones. The kind built over decades. You cut that board too short. It wasn't too short. It definitely was. It was appropriately optimistic. Dad looked at me. You see what I deal with? I do. Dennis pointed the measuring tape toward him. You're still using the wrong end. I've built 3 fences. And? They're all standing. Barely. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the post I was carrying. The morning flew by. By lunchtime we'd finished almost half the fence. Mom came outside carrying sandwiches and lemonade. You boys earned a break. Dad immediately sat down. Dennis stayed standing. You can sit for 5 minutes, Mom said. I'm fine. She gave him a look. One I'd seen her use on Dad countless times. Dennis. He smiled sheepishly. Yes, ma'am. He sat. I watched the exchange with amusement. What? Dennis asked. You actually listen to my mom. Everyone listens to your mom. Smart man, Dad added. Mom rolled her eyes. You're both impossible. During lunch, Dad disappeared inside to answer a work call. Mom followed him. For the first time all day, Dennis and I were alone. He looked at the nearly finished fence. I forgot how much I enjoy working outside. You say that now. Ask me again in August. I smiled. You look better. He glanced at me. Do I? Yeah. More rested. He thought about that. I've been sleeping. The cabin? He nodded. It helped. I'm glad. He looked at me for a moment. You helped. I frowned. I didn't do much. You listened. He smiled quietly. People underestimate how valuable that is. His words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I found myself opening the leather notebook again. I hadn't planned to. It just happened. Most of the entries were exactly as I remembered. Fishing notes. Weather. Funny observations. Then, tucked between 2 pages, I noticed something folded that I hadn't seen before. A photograph. Old enough that the edges had started turning white. 3 young men stood beside the lake. One was obviously my father in his early 20s. Another had to be Dennis. He looked almost nothing like the man I knew now. Longer hair. A ridiculous denim jacket. The biggest smile I'd ever seen on his face. The third man was someone I didn't recognize. All 3 had their arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. I turned the photo over. Written neatly on the back were 4 words. Summer before everything changed. That was it. No date. No explanation. Just those words. The sentence unsettled me. Everything changed. What had happened? The next day I stopped by my parents' house to return a ladder I'd borrowed. Dad was washing his truck in the driveway. Dad? Yeah? I held up the photograph. Who's this? He looked at it for only a second before his expression changed. His smile faded. Oh. You found that. The notebook. He dried his hands slowly. That's Eric. Friend of yours? He nodded. Mine and Dennis's. I've never heard you mention him. Dad looked down at the photograph again. No. I suppose you haven't. What happened? He stayed quiet long enough that I almost apologized for asking. Finally, he said, "We lost touch. Just drifted apart." He shook his head. No. It wasn't that simple. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Regret. Deep regret. Dennis doesn't talk about him either. He wouldn't. Why? Dad stared across the yard. Because some stories belong to the people who lived them. He handed the photo back. If Dennis ever wants you to know. He smiled sadly. He'll tell you himself. I nodded. I understand. But as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the words on the back of that photograph. Summer before everything changed. For the first time since the fishing trip, I realized there were entire chapters of Dennis's life that no one had ever told me. And without meaning to, I found myself wanting to understand the man behind those untold stories. I didn't ask Dennis about the photograph. Not right away. Some questions deserved patience. Over the next month, life settled into a rhythm again, but it wasn't quite the same rhythm I'd left before the fishing trip. I started taking weekends off instead of filling every free hour with work. I cooked more. I called my parents more often. And every Sunday evening, almost without planning it, I found myself stopping by Dennis's house for coffee. Sometimes Dad was there. Sometimes he wasn't. When it was just the two of us, we talked about ordinary things. Books. Projects around the house. Music. Places we still wanted to visit. The conversations never felt forced. They simply continued where the last one had ended. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after the trip, Dennis opened the front door before I had a chance to knock. I figured that was your car. I'm becoming predictable. You always arrive 2 minutes early. I do not. He smiled. You absolutely do. Inside, I noticed a cardboard box sitting in the middle of the living room. What are you doing? He rubbed the back of his neck. Cleaning out the attic. Voluntarily? I finally ran out of excuses. I laughed. Need help? I was hoping you'd ask. For the next 2 hours we sorted through decades of memories. Old camping equipment. Family photo albums. Boxes of letters. Broken fishing reels. Half-finished woodworking projects. At one point Dennis picked up an old baseball glove and smiled. My dad refused to buy me a new one. Why? He said this one still worked. It looks ancient. It was. He laughed. But he wasn't wrong. I noticed another familiar photograph tucked inside one of the boxes. The same 3 young men. Dad. Dennis. Eric. Dennis saw me looking at it. He didn't look away this time. You asked your father about him. It wasn't a question. I did. Dennis sat down slowly in the nearby chair. What did he tell you? Not much. He said the story belonged to you. Dennis was quiet for a long moment. I suppose it does. He looked at the photograph for several seconds before speaking again. Eric was our best friend. The 3 of us did everything together. What happened? Dennis smiled sadly. Life. I frowned. I thought Dad said you didn't just drift apart. We didn't. He took a slow breath. Eric got an opportunity overseas. He left for what was supposed to be 1 year. What happened? He stayed. Were you angry? No. He shook his head. We were proud of him. He smiled softly. But back then, keeping in touch wasn't as easy as it is now. He looked toward the window. We wrote letters. Then fewer letters. Then Christmas cards. And eventually. He shrugged. Silence. I looked at the photograph again. So the summer before everything changed. Was the last summer all 3 of you were together? Dennis nodded. We didn't know it at the time. His voice stayed calm, but there was something deeply human in the way he smiled. I've learned something as I've gotten older. What's that? He leaned back in his chair. Most endings don't announce themselves. You don't know you're seeing someone for the last time. You don't know it's the last barbecue. The last road trip. The last ordinary weekend. He looked at me. If you knew, he smiled, you'd probably pay more attention. Those words stayed with me long after the conversation moved on. A few weeks later, autumn began arriving. The trees around town slowly turned gold. One Saturday morning my phone rang. It was Dennis. You busy? Not really. Want to take a drive? Where? The cabin. I smiled before he even finished the sentence. I'll be ready in 20. The lake looked completely different in autumn. Red and orange leaves covered the shoreline. The air carried that crisp smell that only existed for a few weeks each year. We didn't fish. Neither of us had brought rods. Instead, we walked the familiar trail to the overlook. When we reached the top, Dennis stood beside me without saying anything. Finally, he smiled. You know. What? My grandfather used to say this place reminds you who you are. I looked across the water. Did it? He nodded. It still does. After a moment, I answered quietly. I think it reminded me of something else. He looked at me. What? That the people who matter don't become important all at once. They've usually been there all along. Dennis's smile was small, but genuine. I think your father would like hearing that. He'd probably make fun of me first. Oh, absolutely. We both laughed. The wind carried a few leaves across the overlook. For a while we simply watched them disappear toward the lake. On the drive home, I realized something I hadn't understood at the beginning of the summer. I'd thought that weekend had been about getting away. It wasn't. It had been about paying attention. To people. To time. To conversations that usually get postponed because life feels too busy. Dennis hadn't changed my life through some dramatic lesson or grand speech. He'd done it the same way he'd repaired fences, fixed engines, or rebuilt old docks. Patiently. Quietly. One conversation at a time. Months later, at my parents' annual Christmas dinner, Dad raised a glass before everyone started eating. To family. He looked around the table. And to the people who become family even when they don't have to. His eyes met Dennis's for just a second. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. 35 years of friendship spoke for itself. I looked at the two men laughing over an old story I'd probably heard 10 times before. Then I remembered the note Dennis had hidden inside his grandfather's notebook. The people who change our lives rarely arrive as strangers. He'd been right. Sometimes they've been there since childhood. Sometimes you simply need to grow up before you finally see them. That fishing trip never made me love fishing. I still don't have the patience for it. But every year now, on the first weekend of summer, Dennis and I drive back to that same cabin. We sit on the same porch. Drink the same coffee. Walk the same trail. And before we leave, we stand together for 30 quiet seconds, looking out over the lake. Not because it's tradition. Because some places remind you that life isn't measured by how busy you are. It's measured by the people you choose to slow down with. And that turned out to be the best lesson I brought home from the lake.